They burned my house to force me into their HOA. What they didn't know was I'm the federal judge who would destroy them in court. David Cross had always taken pride in his independence. His house, a sturdy two-story structure of weathered cedar and stone, sat on a quiet hill overlooking Ridge Valley. From his porch, he could see the sunrise spilling across the fields, the faint shimmer of a nearby creek, and the dark green forest that framed the valley like a picture. He had chosen this spot deliberately, a place that was not bound by the bustle of subdivisions, gated neighborhoods, or, most importantly, the heavy hand of homeowners' associations. For David, freedom was more than a word. It was a way of life. He mowed his grass when he wanted, painted his shutters whatever color struck his fancy, and left his truck parked in the gravel driveway without a second thought. He built a small shed with his own two hands, stacked firewood as high as the window ledges, and tended to a garden that grew wild but fruitful. To him, this was living. That peace was interrupted on a Tuesday morning. The knock came sharp, 3 raps against his front door. David, still sipping his coffee, frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Pulling open the door, he found 2 strangers on his porch, well-dressed, clipboards in hand, the kind of people who wore authority like armor. "Mr. Cross?" the taller one asked. "Yeah, who's asking?" David replied, his tone cautious. "We're with the Ridge Valley Homeowners Association," the man said, smiling with the polished ease of a salesman. "You're currently residing on property that borders our community. We're here to inform you of your obligation to join the HOA and bring your property into compliance." David blinked, thinking he had misheard. "Excuse me, obligation. This is my land. I bought it outright 10 years ago. There's no HOA out here." The second representative, a woman with severe glasses and a neatly pinned bun, flipped through her papers. "Our records indicate your parcel falls within the Ridge Valley expansion zone. All properties in this zone are required to join. Membership dues begin at $3,000 annually, plus compliance fees." David set his coffee mug down on the railing, crossing his arms. "Expansion zone? That sounds like something you just made up. This land isn't part of your subdivision. Look around. Do you see cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns up here?" The woman didn't flinch. "Rules are rules, Mr. Cross. Non-compliance will result in fines." David chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Let me save you both the trouble. I'm not joining. I'm not paying a dime. This is my property and you don't control it. End of discussion." The taller man gave a tight smile, scribbled something on his clipboard, and said, "We'll note your refusal, but you'll hear from us again." They left without another word, their polished shoes crunching against the gravel. David watched them walk down the hill, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. He told himself it was nonsense. Surely they had no authority here. Still, the way they spoke carried a cold assurance that gnawed at him. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange, David sat on his porch replaying the encounter. He'd heard horror stories about HOAs, how they dictated everything from mailbox colors to what kind of flowers people planted, how they fined people for leaving garbage cans visible for more than an hour or for daring to park a boat in their own driveway. He had always considered himself lucky to live beyond their reach, until now. The first letter arrived 2 days later. It was slid under his door sometime in the early morning. Thick white paper, official letterhead, bold print at the top, notice of noncompliance. Beneath it, a list of supposed violations: unapproved fencing, unauthorized shed, excessive firewood. Each infraction carried a fine, hundreds of dollars stacked into thousands. At the bottom was a demand, payment due, $3,500. David crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash. "Scare tactics," he muttered. "They can't touch me." But the letters kept coming. Every week another envelope, each one more aggressive, threats of escalating fines, warnings of liens, even vague mentions of legal action. When the third letter came, David decided he'd had enough. He drove into Ridge Valley, pulling his truck into the manicured neighborhood where the HOA office was located. The houses were nearly identical, trimmed hedges, freshly painted shutters, driveways that gleamed as if power washed daily. The office itself was a small brick building at the end of a cul-de-sac, with a shiny plaque that read Ridge Valley HOA Administrative Center. Inside, he found a receptionist who barely looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," David said, slapping the most recent letter on the counter. "You people keep sending me these threats. I don't belong to your HOA. Stop." The receptionist glanced at the paper, typed something, then said in a monotone voice, "If you'd like to dispute your fines, you'll need to attend the next board hearing. Thursday, 7 p.m. Ridge Valley Community Center." David clenched his jaw. "I'm not disputing, I'm refusing. You have no jurisdiction." "Board hearing," she repeated. "Thursday, 7 p.m. Frustrated, David left. Thursday came. Against his better judgment, David showed up. He wanted to face them directly, to shut this nonsense down once and for all. The community center smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh paint. At the front of the room sat 5 board members behind a long table, each with nameplates, water bottles, and stacks of papers. Residents filled the chairs, some whispering nervously, others sitting stiffly as though afraid to move. The chairwoman, a woman in her 50s with a crisp blazer and a permanent scowl, called the meeting to order. After a series of mundane agenda items, budget approvals, landscaping reports, security updates, she turned her eyes on David. "Mr. Cross, please step forward." David walked to the front, letter in hand. "I don't belong here. I don't live in your community. These fines are fraudulent and I won't pay them." Murmurs rippled through the room. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses. "Your property lies within the Ridge Valley Expansion Zone, as designated by the board. You are therefore subject to our regulations." "Expansion Zone," David barked out a laugh. "You can't just draw imaginary lines and declare ownership over land you don't own." "You can bring your objections to arbitration," she replied smoothly. "In the meantime, fines will continue to accrue." David stared at them, fury boiling beneath his calm exterior. "This is extortion, and I won't bow to it." He turned and walked out, ignoring the whispers that followed him. That night, sitting at his kitchen table, David felt the weight of it all pressing down. He wasn't just up against a couple of nosy neighbors. He was up against an institution, one with money, influence, and the arrogance to believe they could control him. But David Cross had built his life on standing firm, and he wasn't about to surrender now. He poured himself another cup of coffee, stared out at the darkness beyond his porch, and whispered to himself, "They picked the wrong man." And so the refusal was made, not just in words spoken at his door or in a community hall, but as a line drawn in the dirt, a line David would defend, no matter how far the HOA was willing to go. David Cross had known stubborn men before, farmers who wouldn't give up their land, mechanics who wouldn't close shop despite debts, veterans who carried old wounds like armor. But he had never imagined he'd find himself in a battle like this. Not with nature, not with an enemy across the ocean, but with his own neighbors, hiding behind the polished veneer of a homeowners association. At first, it had been letters and board meetings, paper and words. Annoying, yes, but still something he could laugh off with a shake of his head and a bitter sip of coffee. But by the second week, the tone shifted. He began finding things. The first note appeared one foggy morning, folded neatly and tucked beneath the welcome mat on his porch. He almost missed it, stepping out with his boots for the morning chores. When he unfolded the paper, his eyes narrowed. The handwriting was jagged, written in thick black marker. "Join or pay the price." David crumpled the note in his fist, scanning the tree line. The woods stood quiet, mist curling between the branches. No one there. Just the eerie stillness that follows after a storm. He told himself it was just another tactic, another way to intimidate him into bending. He burned the note in the fireplace and carried on with his day. But the second one came 2 nights later. He found it pinned under a rock on his porch, the paper damp from dew. This one read, "You think you're strong, we'll break you." David stood there for a long moment, the note trembling slightly in his grip as the cold night air cut through his shirt. A coyote howled in the distance, and suddenly his hilltop cabin didn't feel as safe as it once had. He refused to admit fear, not even to himself. Instead, he nailed the note to the inside of his shed door, a reminder of what he was dealing with. But the harassment escalated. Cars began appearing on the gravel road leading up to his property. At odd hours, midnight dawn, sometimes in the dead silence of 3 in the morning, headlights would sweep across his windows. Vehicles idled just long enough for him to notice before slowly driving away. Sometimes he caught glimpses, a silhouette holding up a phone to snap photos, or the glint of glasses reflecting his porch light. He stopped sleeping soundly. The woods that once brought him peace now bristled with menace. Every rustle of leaves could be someone hiding. Every crunch of gravel could be footsteps creeping closer. The neighbors noticed, too. At the small general store down in Ridge Valley, whispers followed him. "That's the man fighting the board. He won't last long. They'll ruin him if he doesn't give in. They always do." One old man, leaning on a cane, muttered as David passed by, "Son, you can't fight them. Best to pay what they want and move on." But David wasn't built that way. He clenched his jaw and ignored them, though the words dug deep. He tried to distract himself with work, cutting wood, repairing the shed roof, even repainting the shutters a deep forest green just to prove he could. But no matter how many tasks he set himself, the tension lingered, crawling beneath his skin. Then came the unthinkable. It was a Friday night, clear and still. David sat in his living room, reading an old paperback under the warm glow of a lamp. Outside, the crickets chirped their steady rhythm. The creek murmured faintly in the distance. For a brief moment, he felt almost normal again. Thn. Crash. Glass shattered in the kitchen. David leapt to his feet, heart pounding. He grabbed the old baseball bat he kept by the door and crept toward the sound. Shards glittered across the floor like ice. A brick lay among them, wrapped in paper. Hands trembling with rage more than fear, he unwrapped it. Scrawled in black marker, the message screamed, "Last warning, leave or pay." David's breath came heavy. His pulse hammered in his ears. Whoever had thrown this hadn't just threatened him, they had invaded his sanctuary, his home, his fortress. He stormed onto the porch, scanning the dark tree line. A car engine revved faintly in the distance, then faded into the night. David stood in the chill air, bat gripped tight, shoulders squared. For the first time, he felt the weight of just how dangerous this game had become. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about dues or fines. This was war. He swept up the glass, patched the window with plywood, and sat awake the rest of the night, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the darkness. When dawn broke, he called the sheriff's office. A deputy came, took down his statement, glanced at the note, but his tone carried little urgency. "Probably some kids," the deputy said. "We'll keep an eye out, but without witnesses, there's not much we can do." David wanted to shout, to demand action, but the look in the deputy's eyes told him more than the words did. This wasn't kids. This was organized, and the deputy knew it. As the patrol car drove away, David stood on his porch, jaw set, fists clenched. The HOA thought they could break him. They thought they could scare him into submission. But they had underestimated the one thing that had kept him alive this long: resolve. The sun rose over Ridge Valley, painting the sky in hues of gold. David stared at it, exhaustion etched into his face, determination burning in his chest. "They think I'll bend," he muttered to himself. "They're wrong." Still, as he turned back inside, His eyes lingered on the broken window, the brick, the message scrawled in black. For the first time, a question whispered through the back of his mind, one he hated to admit even to himself. What if this was only the beginning? The night was quiet at first, too quiet. After weeks of headlights creeping up the gravel road, of notes pinned to his porch, of shattered glass and whispered threats, David almost welcomed the stillness. He sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, staring out at the valley below. The air was crisp, the stars sharp against the blackness, the kind of night that reminded him why he had chosen to live here in the first place. The silence, however, didn't last. It started with a smell, acrid, sharp, like burning plastic. David frowned, lowering his mug. Then came the roar, sudden, violent, unnatural. He turned toward the sound and his blood turned cold. The side of his house was ablaze. Flames licked up the wooden siding as though they'd been waiting for a chance to feast. In seconds, fire leapt to the roof, crackling and snarling like a living beast. Smoke poured into the night sky, choking, black and heavy. David ran inside, shouting, grabbing what little he could: his phone, his shotgun, the small box of papers that held the deed to his land. But the heat was unbearable, the smoke suffocating. By the time he staggered back out onto the porch, flames had swallowed the living room where he had been sitting only minutes before. "God, no," he muttered, his throat raw. The fire spread faster than he could comprehend. The dry timber of the cabin, the stacks of firewood piled nearby, the very air itself seemed to feed the inferno. Windows exploded outward, shards scattering like shrapnel. The roof groaned under the weight of its own destruction before collapsing inward with a thunderous crash. David stumbled back, eyes wide, chest heaving. He had never felt so powerless. The home he had built, repaired, and defended was being devoured in front of him, reduced to ash before his very eyes. By the time the fire trucks arrived, sirens screaming through the valley, it was already too late. Firefighters jumped out, hoses hissing, boots pounding against gravel. But all they could do was contain the blaze, stopping it from spreading to the forest beyond. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the road, their faces pale in the orange glow. Some whispered, others shook their heads. No one stepped forward to help. When the last flame finally died, only a blackened skeleton remained. Smoke curled upward like a funeral pyre. David stood in the cold dawn light, his face streaked with soot, his eyes hollow. The house was gone. His sanctuary was nothing but cinders. He thought he had no tears left in him, but one fell anyway, carving a line through the ash on his cheek. The next day, as the smoke still lingered, a car pulled up the gravel drive. Sleek, polished, a stark contrast to the ruin it approached. Out stepped Richard Mallory, the HOA president. David had seen him once before, sitting at the center of the board table in the community hall, eyes gleaming with self-importance. Now, in the light of morning, his expression carried something darker. Mallory surveyed the destruction with a practiced detachment, as if he were appraising damage to property that wasn't his but still under his control. He let the silence stretch before finally speaking. "Accidents happen," Mallory said. His voice was calm, smooth, almost casual, but his smirk betrayed him. "Maybe next time you'll listen." David said nothing. His fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to lunge, to grab the man by the collar, to make him feel even a fraction of the loss that burned in David's chest. But he held back, not because he was afraid, but because he knew this was bigger now. This wasn't a fire, it was a message. And David would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Mallory tilted his head, smirk widening slightly. "You had a nice place here. Shame to see it go. Ridge Valley's insurance partners are very reliable, though. If you'd been part of the association, you might have had coverage." The words hung in the air like poison. Then, with a shrug, Mallory turned and walked back to his car. The tires crunched over gravel, fading into the distance, leaving only silence and the stench of smoke behind. David remained where he stood, staring at the ruins. His heart hammered not with despair anymore, but with something sharper: anger, resolve. He crouched down, picking up a half-charred piece of wood, turning it over in his hand. Black soot crumbled against his palm. His home was gone, yes, but so was any illusion that this was merely a dispute over dues or paperwork. This was war, organized, calculated, cruel. And in that moment, David made a vow, quiet, unshakable. They wanted to break him. Instead, they had given him purpose. The flames had taken his home, but in their place, they had forged something stronger. His resolve to fight, to expose, to bring down the empire of intimidation that had dared set fire to his life. David straightened, wiped the soot from his hands onto his jeans, and whispered into the smoky air, "This isn't the end, it's the beginning." And he meant every word. For days after the fire, Ridge Valley buzzed with whispers. Some said it had been an accident, a faulty wire or careless spark from the fireplace. Others muttered more quietly, almost fearfully, that the flames had been no accident at all, that the HOA had finally dealt with their most stubborn opponent. To the board members, it was a victory. They smirked among themselves in their meetings, congratulated one another over wine in manicured backyards, and whispered of how easily power bent those who resisted. But they didn't know David Cross. To them, he was just a man on a hill, a loner, a recluse, someone who thought he was above the rules. They thought the fire had broken him. They thought the loss of his home, the jeers of neighbors, and the smug taunts of their president had left him hollow. We're wrong. Because David Cross wasn't just a man on a hill. He wasn't just a stubborn homeowner clinging to his rights. He was Judge David Cross, one of the toughest federal judges in the state. A man known for his unshakable integrity, his razor-sharp rulings, and his merciless dissection of corruption in his courtroom. Corporations had learned to fear his name. Shady politicians had watched their careers crumble under his gaze. Crime families had cursed him in private as their empires dissolved. And now, for the first time in his career, the war wasn't about strangers or about abstract principles or even about justice for nameless victims. This time it was personal. In the quiet that followed the fire, David kept to himself. He stayed with an old friend for a few days, then rented a small, nondescript cabin down the valley. Outwardly, he seemed broken, retreating from sight, letting the board believe their intimidation had worked. But inside, gears turned. Files were compiled. Letters and notes, photographs of cars idling outside his home, recordings of threats, all carefully logged. The charred remains of his cabin were surveyed, samples of accelerant collected discreetly by a contact in the fire marshal's office. And in a plain black notebook, David began drafting something not as a victim, but as the judge he truly was, the framework for a case that would tear the mask off the Ridge Valley HOA. It began with whispers of his name. One board member, curious, decided to look him up. "Cross," she muttered one evening as she typed into her laptop. "David Cross, homeowner." But the search returned something else. Articles, headlines, case records, photographs of a stern-faced man in a courtroom, black robes draped over his shoulders, the gavel poised in his hand. Her stomach dropped. The next morning, the boardroom hummed with unease. "Did you know who he is?" she demanded, slamming a printout of one of the articles on the polished oak table. The others leaned forward, reading the words aloud. "Federal Judge David Cross delivers landmark ruling on racketeering. Judge Cross strikes down corrupt zoning ordinance tied to real estate syndicate. Feared Judge Cross known for relentless pursuit of justice." Faces paled, the smug smiles vanished. President Mallory scoffed at first, waving a dismissive hand. "Titles mean nothing. A judge or not, he's just another man in this valley. His robe doesn't protect him out here." But his voice trembled ever so slightly, and the others noticed. because beneath the bravado they all knew what it meant. They hadn't burned the house of a nobody. They hadn't threatened some defenseless recluse. They had picked a fight with one of the most powerful legal minds in the state, a man with allies, a man with reach, a man with the ability to dismantle them piece by piece in a court of law. And worse, now he had motive. David revealed himself not in words, but in action. The first subpoena landed like a thunderclap, delivered by a federal marshal in broad daylight right to the HOA office. The receptionist's eyes widened as the sealed envelope was placed on the counter. Inside, a demand for financial records, correspondence logs, and board meeting transcripts spanning the last 5 years. The second came a week later. This one targeted individual board members, demanding personal banking records, disclosure of property assets, and email communications. By the third, the whispers in Ridge Valley turned into open talk. Neighbors who had once laughed at David now spoke in hushed tones. "Did you hear? He's a federal judge. No wonder he's fighting back. I heard subpoenas went out. They're finished." Mallory tried to hold his board together, but cracks formed quickly. Some wanted to resign quietly, to flee before the storm hit. Others grew defiant, convinced they could still intimidate him into dropping it. But David remained silent. No threats, no bluster, no shouting, just a calm, relentless pressure that grew heavier with every passing day. In private, David allowed himself a moment of reflection. The fire still haunted him, the roar of the flames, the choking smoke, the sight of his sanctuary collapsing into ash. But more than loss, it had given him clarity. For years he had sat on the bench handing down rulings, watching corruption slither through the cracks of communities like Ridge Valley. He had seen the damage done, but had always been forced to keep a judge's distance. Detached, impartial. Now that distance was gone. They had come for him. They had taken his home, and in doing so they had made him not just a judge but a victim, and that gave him something rarer than authority, conviction sharpened by personal fire. This was no longer about a cabin. This was about exposing the rot at the heart of Ridge Valley, the arrogance of men like Richard Mallory, and the culture of intimidation that had silenced neighbors for years. As he stared at the stack of documents spread across the small table in his rented cabin, David felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Not anger, not grief. Resolve. The HOA thought the fire was the end of him. But they had only lit the fuse of something far greater. Now Judge David Cross was coming for them. And this time, he wasn't wearing the mask of a quiet homeowner on a hill. This time, he was wearing the robe. David Cross had built careers on evidence. In his courtroom, cases had been won and lost on details as small as a missing signature or the phrasing of a clause buried 3 pages deep in a contract. He knew how fragile justice could be when evidence was absent, and how unstoppable it became when evidence was irrefutable. This time, the case wasn't a file on his desk. It was his life, his land, and the home reduced to ashes because he dared to say no. The morning after the fire, David called in a favor from the bureau. By mid-afternoon, 2 black SUVs wound their way up the ridge, stopping where his house had once stood. Out stepped a pair of federal investigators, grim-faced, briefcases in hand. They took one look at the charred remains, then at David. "Judge Cross," one of them said carefully, "we understand the sensitivity of this. But if what you're claiming is true, this isn't just an HOA issue. It's organized crime." David nodded. "Then treat it like one. They think they've destroyed the wrong man. I intend to prove them right." The investigation moved quickly. What had started as whispered rumors among neighbors unfolded into a map of corruption sprawling across Ridge Valley. Agents sifted through HOA financial records, subpoenaed bank statements, and questioned former homeowners who had fled under duress. A pattern emerged. Families had been fined for everything imaginable. A mailbox painted the wrong shade of beige. a garden fence that disrupted the visual flow, a pickup truck parked overnight in a driveway. At first, the finds seemed like standard HOA pettiness, but stacked together, they revealed something darker: systematic financial bleeding. One elderly couple had paid nearly $40,000 over the years just to keep their modest ranch-style house. Another man had been forced into foreclosure when the HOA placed a fraudulent lien after he refused to replace his perfectly good roof. But the most chilling testimony came from a young mother named Claire Dawson. She had lost her home after her husband refused to comply with an arbitrary landscaping violation. With tears streaming down her face, she explained how board members showed up outside her house in the middle of the night, shining headlights into her windows, leaving threatening notes. "I thought it was just us," she whispered during her deposition. "But when I heard what happened to you, Judge Cross, I realized this isn't just harassment, it's terror." Piece by piece, David and the investigators built a picture of the HOA as more than just a neighborhood committee. It was a racket, a cartel hiding under the thin veneer of community association. The financial fraud was staggering. The HOA had inflated maintenance costs, hired contractors who were nothing more than shell companies run by relatives of board members, and diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts. One spreadsheet stood out, a ledger listing special assessments that had no basis in law or necessity. Every dime went directly into a private fund controlled by the HOA president, Victor Hale. Hale's name surfaced again and again, connected to fraudulent signatures, falsified liens, and aggressive foreclosure threats. But even as the evidence grew, the arson weighed heavy in David's mind. The fire was more than destruction of property. It was an escalation, a warning. He brought in arson specialists who combed the wreckage of his house. Their report confirmed his suspicions. The blaze hadn't been an accident. Chemical accelerants had been poured along the back porch, the same porch where he used to sit at night with a glass of bourbon, staring at the valley lights. The fire had been deliberate, calculated, and the timing right after he refused to bend was no coincidence. When David reviewed the findings with the investigators, the room fell silent. "This isn't just financial fraud anymore," one agent said. "This is racketeering, intimidation, possibly even attempted murder. They wanted you gone, Judge Cross, permanently." David leaned back in his chair, his jaw set. "Good, that makes it federal." The case began to snowball. Local news stations caught wind of the investigation. Reporters lingered outside Ridgewood Estates, shoving microphones at residents as they tried to drive home from work. Some refused to speak, fearing retaliation. Others, finally emboldened by David's defiance, unleashed years of pent-up frustration. One man showed reporters a binder stuffed with violation letters, each one more ridiculous than the last. "I got fined $200 for leaving my trash can at the curb too long," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "But when I paid it, they claimed it was late and added another $500. It never stopped. I lost my house to these vultures." Another woman told a story eerily similar to David. Headlights outside her window at night, cars idling just out of sight, phone calls where no one spoke but heavy breathing filled the line. The more people spoke, the more a pattern emerged. Ridgewood's HOA wasn't just corrupt, it was predatory. David didn't stop at testimony. He pushed deeper. He wanted hard proof that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. With federal backing, investigators secured warrants for the HOA office and the private residences of its board members. What they found was damning. Hard drives filled with falsified invoices. Hidden safe deposit boxes stuffed with cash. Emails between board members discussing how to handle resistant homeowners. One message chilled David to his core. "If Cross doesn't fall in line, we'll do what we did to Dawson. He'll get the message." That single line, vague as it was, connected the harassment of multiple families directly to the board's decision-making. It wasn't rogue behavior. It was orchestrated. As the evidence piled up, David's fury only sharpened into resolve. These people thought they could manipulate the law, weaponize fear, and burn down the home of a federal judge without consequence. They hadn't counted on him fighting back with every ounce of his influence, knowledge, and authority. But David also knew the fight wouldn't be easy. Hale and his cronies weren't going down without swinging. Already, anonymous letters arrived at his temporary residence. "Drop it or lose more than a house," one note read in crude block letters. Another was simpler, a matchstick taped to a sheet of paper with the word "next" scrawled underneath. David showed the notes to investigators, his expression unreadable. "They're panicking," he said. "Good, panic makes people sloppy." The case was growing larger than he had anticipated. What started as his personal vendetta had become a battle for every homeowner crushed under Ridgewood's tyranny. But David welcomed the scope. In his courtroom, he had always fought for fairness within the confines of the law. Now he was fighting for freedom, his and everyone else. And this time the law wasn't just on his side. He was the law. When the agents closed another long day of interviews and evidence review, David stood outside in the cooling night air, staring at the empty ridge where his home once stood. The ashes no longer felt like defeat, they felt like fuel. The HOA thought they had destroyed his foundation. Instead, they had given him a new one. A case strong enough to bury them. For years, David Cross had presided over cases that determined the fate of others. But now he was building the most important case of his life. And when it went to trial, he intended to make sure the verdict echoed louder than the fire that tried to silence him. The federal courthouse was packed long before proceedings began. Reporters jostled for space on the marble steps outside, their cameras pointed at the entrance as if waiting for a celebrity. But this wasn't a red carpet premiere. This was a reckoning. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Rows of Ridgewood residents filled the gallery, some with arms crossed tightly, others with hopeful eyes that this nightmare might finally end. Victims of harassment sat shoulder to shoulder, united in a silent solidarity that had been missing for years. They had lived in fear of the HOA board, but today was different. Today, they had Judge David Cross in their corner. At the defense table sat the Ridgewood HOA board, President Victor Hale, Treasurer Martin Briggs, Secretary Linda Palmer, and two other directors whose names had become synonymous with intimidation in Ridge Valley. Their expensive suits couldn't hide the sweat glistening on their brows. Papers shuffled nervously in front of them, though they knew the weight of evidence wasn't in their favor. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Carla Jennings, adjusted her glasses as she rose from her seat. She had built a career on dismantling corporate fraud cases, but even she admitted privately that this trial was extraordinary. It wasn't just about stolen money. It was about corruption weaponized at the most personal level of people's lives, their homes, their sanctuaries. "All rise," the bailiff called. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harold Whittaker entered and took his seat. His presence was commanding, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on the defendants. "You may be seated," he said, his voice deep and steady. Opening statements. Jennings wasted no time. She stepped to the center of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about power abused, laws ignored, and lives destroyed. The defendants before you did not serve their community. They exploited it. They weaponized rules meant to keep order and twisted them into tools of extortion. They harassed, intimidated, and even threatened violence against those who dared to resist." Her words were deliberate, each one landing like a hammer. She held up a thick binder. "In here are hundreds of violation notices, each one fraudulent, each one part of a scheme to bleed homeowners dry. And when money wasn't enough, when intimidation didn't work, they escalated. They set fire to a man's home. That man was David Cross, and today he will tell you his story." She turned, locking eyes with the jury. "By the end of this trial, you will see these defendants for what they are, not community leaders, but criminals hiding behind the false authority of an HOA." When Jennings returned to her seat, the defense attorney rose. Richard Lowell, sharp-suited and sharp-tongued, adjusted his tie and strode forward with practiced confidence. "The government would have you believe this is some grand conspiracy," he began. "But what we have here is nothing more than misunderstandings, disgruntled homeowners, and ordinary mistakes blown wildly out of proportion." He gestured toward the defendants. "These are community volunteers. They dedicated their time to keeping Ridgewood beautiful, organized, and safe. Were there disagreements? Certainly. Were there fines? Of course, that's what HOAs do. But conspiracy, arson, that is a stretch beyond belief." Lowell leaned closer to the jury. "The prosecution's star witness is a federal judge who, in his grief and anger over a tragic fire, has mistaken coincidence for intent. We trust you to see through the sensationalism and focus on facts." He returned to his seat, though his client's pale faces betrayed their lack of faith. The evidence unfolds. Over the next week, the courtroom became a theater of exposure. Jennings meticulously laid out the government's case. First came the paper trail, hundreds of violation letters shown on a projector for the jury to see. Each was stamped with official HOA letterhead, each signed by board members, each demanding exorbitant sums. A forensic accountant explained how payments were siphoned into shell accounts. Then came the witnesses. Claire Dawson sat trembling in the witness chair as she recounted nights of harassment. Her voice cracked as she described headlights outside her window, threatening phone calls, and the eventual foreclosure of her home. "They told me if we didn't pay, we'd regret it," she said through tears. "And we did. We lost everything." Her words hung heavy in the courtroom. The defendants shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet her gaze. More witnesses followed. An elderly couple nearly driven into bankruptcy. A father who sold his home under duress. Neighbors who described intimidation tactics eerily similar to what David endured. But the climax came when Jennings called David Cross himself to the stand. David takes the stand. The courtroom hushed as David walked to the witness chair. He wore a dark suit, his bearing calm and resolute. This was not Judge Cross presiding from a bench. This was David Cross, a man whose home had been reduced to ash. After being sworn in, Jennings approached. "Mr. Cross, could you tell the jury what happened on the night of the fire?" David's voice was steady, though beneath it was an undercurrent of controlled fury. "I was asleep when I heard the roar. By the time I stepped outside, flames had already consumed half the house. I called the fire department, but it was too late. Everything was gone." Jennings nodded. "And the day after the fire, did you encounter anyone from the Ridgewood HOA?" David's eyes flicked toward the defense table. "Yes. Victor Hale came to my property. He looked me in the eye and said, 'Accidents happen. Maybe next time you'll listen.'" A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Hale squirmed, whispering urgently to his attorney. Jennings pressed on. "Mr. Cross, why are you here today?" David leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the jury. His voice was like steel, sharp and unyielding. "Because they believed I was powerless. They believed they could use fear, intimidation, and fire to silence me. But I am here to say this. No one, not a corporation, not a cartel, not even a board hiding behind the letters HOA, is above the law." The silence that followed was electric. Even the reporters stopped scribbling notes, stunned by the raw authority in his words. The defense falters. When Lowell cross-examined, he tried to undermine David's credibility. "Judge Cross, isn't it true that you have a personal vendetta against these individuals because of your home's destruction?" David met his gaze without flinching. I have a vendetta against corruption. My house is gone, yes, but what they did to me, they also did to countless others. This is bigger than me." Lowell pressed harder, but David's composure never wavered. The jury watched intently, and each attempt to discredit him seemed only to reinforce his integrity. Closing arguments. After weeks of testimony, the trial neared its end. Jennings rose for her closing argument. These defendants believed their titles gave them untouchable power. They believed they could harass families, steal their money, and burn down homes to enforce their will. But thanks to the courage of victims and the evidence we've seen, the truth is undeniable. She turned to the jury, her voice rising. This was not an HOA. This was organized crime hiding in plain sight, and justice demands accountability. Lowell, looking worn, made one final plea. Do not confuse suspicion with proof. Do not let passion cloud reason. These are your neighbors, not criminals. Don't let the government paint them as monsters when they are nothing more than flawed people trying to manage a community. But his words rang hollow. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. On the charge of racketeering, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of arson, guilty. One by one, the charges were read. The HOA board members sat frozen, their empire crumbling in real time. As the verdicts were finalized, Judge Whitaker looked down at the defendants. You abused your positions, terrorized your community, and thought yourselves untouchable. This court disagrees. Sentencing will be swift and severe. David sat quietly as the courtroom erupted, residents embracing, reporters rushing to the phones, and the HOA board being led away in handcuffs. For the first time in months, he felt the weight on his chest ease. The fire had taken his house, but today had given him something greater, justice. And as he rose from the witness chair, the thought crystallized in his mind. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of rebuilding, not just for him, but for every family who had lived under Ridgewood's shadow. The verdict was swift. The HOA leaders were convicted of arson, extortion, and racketeering. Their assets were seized. Several faced decades in prison. The courtroom erupted in relief from former victims. Justice had not only been served, it had been delivered by the very man they once tried to destroy. The land where David Cross's home once burned now carried a different energy. The blackened remains were gone, hauled away months ago, leaving no trace of the night when fire had consumed his life. In their place stood a new house, sturdy, gleaming, a fortress of resilience that seemed to rise defiantly against the ridge's skyline. It wasn't just a house, it was a declaration. David had worked closely with architects, builders, and even fire safety experts. The new cabin was fireproofed with reinforced steel beams and insulated concrete walls disguised beneath timber siding that blended into the natural landscape. The windows were triple glazed, resistant not only to flames but to break-ins. Hidden within the structure were layers of security, discrete cameras, motion sensors, and a reinforced safe room. Every detail had been deliberate. The home wasn't built in fear. It was built as a symbol that intimidation had failed. On a crisp autumn morning, David sat on the wide cedar porch, his coffee steaming in the cool air. The valley stretched before him, golden with the season's colors. Birds flitted through the trees, their calls sharp and clear, no longer drowned out by the weight of dread. For the first time since the fire, peace had returned to Ridge Valley. A community transformed. Ridgewood Estates had changed too. The HOA board members were gone, most serving prison sentences, their empire dismantled in court. In their absence, the community began to breathe again. Neighbors who once lived in isolation and fear now greeted each other openly, holding block parties, gardening without harassment, and repainting their homes in colors they actually liked. Claire Dawson, the young mother who had lost her home, returned to the valley, this time moving into a modest rental while working with attorneys to reclaim damages from the HOA fund. The elderly couple who had nearly lost everything found themselves embraced by neighbors offering help, kindness, and for the first time in years, safety. Even the press had not forgotten. The trial had become a landmark case in property law, exposing how far-reaching and unchecked HOAs could become when power was left unchallenged. Across the state, and even beyond, communities began scrutinizing their associations, demanding transparency and protections for homeowners. What happened in Ridge Valley had become a cautionary tale, but also a beacon of resistance. And at the center of it all was David Cross. The judge, the man. For years, David had been known only as Judge Cross, the unyielding arbiter who ruled from behind the bench. His reputation for dismantling corruption had been respected, even feared. But the trial had stripped away that judicial armor. People saw not only the judge, but the man, the victim who had lost everything and fought back with courage that inspired others. Now when he walked into town, strangers approached to shake his hand. "Thank you," they would say, voices filled with sincerity. Some left letters at his mailbox, not threats but gratitude. Stories of their own HOA battles spilled out, stories of fines, harassment, and intimidation. David read each one, offering advice where he could, sometimes even referring them to attorneys he trusted. He hadn't planned to become a symbol, but sometimes symbols chose you. The porch of reflection. That morning on the porch, David thought about what had been taken from him. The house reduced to ash had carried memories, his late wife's favorite chair, shelves of books collected over decades, photographs that no digital backup could truly replace. There was grief in that loss, grief that lingered like shadows in the corners of his mind. But grief no longer ruled him. He had gained something larger, the proof that tyranny, no matter how small or local, could be defeated. That ordinary people, when given a voice and a chance, could topple systems designed to control them. His new home stood as a monument not only to his survival, but to the resilience of everyone who had ever suffered under Ridgewood's reign. He sipped his coffee, the taste rich and grounding, and let the dawn's warmth settle over him. Visitors on the ridge. The quiet was interrupted by the crunch of tires on gravel. A car pulled up, and from it stepped Evelyn Harper, the retired attorney who had first brought him the whistleblower's files. She was older, slower in her movements now, but her eyes carried the same fire. "You've done it," she said with a smile as she climbed the porch steps. "The board's gone, the community's free, and you've got a new house standing stronger than ever." David nodded. "We've done it, you, me, and everyone who refused to stay silent." Evelyn chuckled softly. "Do you realize what you've started, David? Other HOAs across the country are being investigated now. People saw what happened here and realized they don't have to live under the boot." David leaned back in his chair. "Good, then it was worth it." For a moment they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the valley. A hawk circled above, its cry sharp against the wind. A symbol reborn. When Evelyn left, David walked the perimeter of his property. He ran his hand along the smooth timber siding, felt the strength of the reinforced walls beneath, and stopped at the spot where the fire had burned hottest. Here, the porch beam had collapsed in flames. Here, he had stood watching his life dissolve into embers. Now in that same spot rose a column of steel wrapped in cedar, unshakable, fireproof, a rebirth. David placed his hand on it and breathed deeply. The house was more than lumber and stone. It was proof that no matter how much destruction corruption tried to bring, something stronger could rise from its ashes. The valley without fear. As weeks turned into months, the valley's spirit grew lighter. Children played in the streets without parents fearing HOA fines for noise violations. Gardens flourished in colors beyond approved shades of green. Neighbors built fences, painted murals, and even started a small farmer's market on weekends. The shadow of the Ridgewood HOA was gone. David often walked through town, greeted not with suspicion but with smiles. He saw the life returning to people's eyes, the freedom in their choices. Ridge Valley no longer lived in fear. It lived in community, the very thing the HOA had pretended to protect but had only ever destroyed. Closing the circle. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in hues of fire and gold, David returned to his porch. He poured a glass of bourbon, set it on the railing, and lifted it toward the valley below. "To those who lost," he murmured, "and to those who rose again." The air was cool, the world quiet except for the whisper of wind through the trees. For the first time in a long time, David felt not just like a judge, not just like a survivor, but like a man finally home. The ashes had given birth to something greater. And as long as his cabin stood, so too would the reminder. Corruption could burn, intimidate, and destroy, but it could never win. Just when David thought the storm was over, a mysterious package arrived at his temporary office. Inside were flash drives and handwritten notes. A former HOA treasurer had turned informant. The files revealed connections far bigger than Ridge Valley, networks of HOAs across the state secretly working together, funneling money into offshore accounts. David realized what he had faced wasn't just one corrupt board. It was part of a machine. David stood before a task force of federal agents, the files spread across the table. "This isn't about me anymore," he told them. "This is about every homeowner who was silenced, bullied, or robbed by people hiding behind the name of association." The agents nodded. The operation was bigger now, and David wasn't just a victim, he was leading the charge. As he left the room, he thought back to the night of the fire. They had tried to destroy him. Instead, they had ignited something far worse for themselves, a federal crusade.